He found it on a Saturday morning, the way he found most things that mattered. By accident, tucked between 2 pages of a document he'd already read. The Chubb binder was thick, the way all of Sutton Vance's insurance portfolios were thick, organized by a paralegal. He paid well enough that she never asked questions about the items listed inside. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee, standing at the window of his midtown penthouse, with the city 42 floors below him, doing what the city always did on Saturday mornings, moving without him, indifferent to his schedule, when his thumb caught the edge of something that didn't belong. A card, stiff, printed on both sides, laminated with the kind of care you take when you want something to last. He read it once, then he read it again. It listed the contents of his private collection with a precision that should have been impossible. Not the appraised values. Those were in the binder. The acquisition dates, the provenance gaps, the items that existed in his possession but not technically on any document that a court could subpoena. 17 items listed in the order he had acquired them, with the kind of specificity that meant whoever wrote this had been inside that room, or had spoken to someone who had. Below the list, in clean typeset, a single paragraph. One of these will no longer be yours by next Saturday, not the most valuable, the one with no paper trail, the one you can't report missing. You know which one. Sutton Vance stood at that window for a long time. Then he called his head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Briggs, who had worked for 3 different principals before Vance and who charged accordingly. He read Briggs the card over the phone. There was a silence on the other end that Vance recognized as the silence of a professional recalibrating. "I want it laminated," Vance said when Briggs had finished asking his questions. "Sir, the card. I want it laminated, and I want it on my office wall, above the collection room door." Another silence. "Mr. Vance, it's a conversation piece," Vance said. "Whoever sent this wanted me afraid. I want them to know I'm not." He had it laminated by Monday. It went up Tuesday morning, above the door at eye level, where anyone who visited his private office would see it before they saw anything else. He told the story twice that week, once to his attorney, once to a man he'd done business with for 20 years who laughed in the right places and said the right things about the kind of person who would pull a stunt like that. A crank, a fantasist, someone who had watched too many movies and didn't understand the difference between a threat and a performance. By Friday evening, the collection room had 10 guards on rotation. By Saturday morning, it still had 10, and the item with no paper trail, the one Vance had moved quietly to what he was certain was an impenetrable location, was gone. The security team reviewed every camera in the building for 4 days. They found nothing they could explain. They found a man who had been in the building twice, in a role so procedurally necessary that his presence had been logged and immediately forgotten. They found no evidence of forced entry. They found no evidence of any entry at all into the location where the item had been moved. What they found in the hollow base of the taxidermied black bear mounted in Vance's private study was the laminated card, retrieved from the wall above the collection room door, where it had been since Tuesday, with one line added beneath the original text in the same clean typeset as everything else. As promised. Briggs resigned the following Monday. He did not give a reason. He didn't need to. This is the story of how that happened. Not all of it. Some of it will stay where it belongs, which is in the space between what you can prove and what you know. But enough of it. Enough that by the end you'll understand why Sutton Vance never filed a report, never called anyone he couldn't control, and never took anything off his office wall. Not the laminated card. Not anything else. If you've been here before, you know how this works. If you're new, the gentleman doesn't explain himself. He acts. You watch. The like button is there if you want to stay in the room, and the subscribe is there if you want to be here the next time he walks into one. The question I'll leave you with before we go back to the beginning is this. He told the man exactly what he was going to take. The man laminated the note and put it on his wall. Would you have taken it seriously? Think about that while the story runs. Now, 6 weeks before that Saturday morning, before the binder, before the card, before Briggs and his 10 guards and the 4 days of footage that explained nothing, before any of it, Sutton Vance did not think of himself as a predator. This was important to understand, not because it was true, it wasn't particularly, but because his self-conception was the architecture everything else was built on. He thought of himself as a specialist, a man with an unusual skill for identifying value that other people had failed to protect adequately. He had a phrase he used in rooms where he felt comfortable, a phrase that had smoothed over a great many conversations with a great many people who should have pushed back harder. I find things before they're lost. What he meant, though he never said this, was that he found families in distress and made himself useful to them at the precise moment their distress made them unable to evaluate what useful cost. He had been doing it for 31 years. It had started with estate sales, the legitimate kind, the kind where a family loses a patriarch and doesn't know what the contents of the house are worth and hires an appraiser who happens to know Sutton Vance and happens to mention, quietly, that there's a buyer interested in a quick, clean transaction that avoids the delays of a formal auction. 31 years ago, this was opportunism. Now it was a system. He had relationships with 3 probate attorneys, 2 estate appraisers, and 1 judge in a county outside the city whose docket moved at a pace that suited Vance's interests considerably more than it suited the interests of anyone contesting a will. The items in his private collection were not technically stolen. That was the precise word he used when he thought about it, which wasn't often. Technically. Every acquisition had documentation. Every transfer had been signed. The families who had signed were families in crisis, liquidity problems, contested wills, medical costs, the particular financial vertigo that descends on people who have inherited something irreplaceable, but not anything liquid, and Vance's offers had been legal and fast and final. The families hadn't understood what they were signing away. That wasn't his problem. That was their attorney's problem, and their attorney had often been one of his. The collection room on the 42nd floor held 47 items. 31 of them had paper trails clean enough to withstand scrutiny. 16 of them did not. Not because the transactions were illegal. They weren't, or not provably, but because the documentation that existed told a story that Vance preferred not to tell out loud. Acquisition prices a fraction of appraised value. Sellers who had been in no position to negotiate. A few cases where the item had been listed in a will and the beneficiary had never received it, because by the time the will was probated, the item had already moved. The one with no paper trail was not the most valuable piece in the room. It wasn't the most beautiful. It was a small carved wooden box, Federal period, with a lock that no longer worked, and an interior lining of faded blue silk. It had belonged to a family in Philadelphia for 200 years before it belonged to Sutton Vance. He had acquired it 8 years ago from a woman named Carol Beaumont, 73 years old, who had been contesting her brother's will with an attorney who happened to owe Vance a favor. The box had not been in the will. It had been in a cabinet in the brother's study, and it had moved from that cabinet to a courier to Vance's collection room in the span of a week, while Carol Beaumont was still in depositions that she eventually lost. Vance kept it because it was the kind of thing that could not be replaced. Not because of its market value. It had one, and it wasn't extraordinary, but because of what it represented. It was proof that the system worked exactly the way he needed it to work. Every time, with no friction and no consequence. He looked at it occasionally in the way that some men look at trophies, not with affection, with confirmation. He had not thought about Carol Beaumont in 7 years. The gentleman had been thinking about her for 6 weeks. He had come to the case the way he came to most things, sideways, through a thread that most people would have let go. A conversation at a legal aid clinic in West Philadelphia, where he had spent 3 days doing something that looked to anyone watching like pro bono document review for a nonprofit that assisted elderly clients with estate matters. He was not a lawyer. He had never claimed to be. He was a volunteer, which in the context of that clinic meant he was a man with patience and attention, and a particular interest in cases where the paperwork told a different story than the outcome. He read files. He asked quiet questions. He bought coffee for a paralegal named Simone, who had worked at the clinic for 11 years, and who had, in that time, developed a specific and well-calibrated fury about a category of case she described as clean robberies. Carol Beaumont's file was one of them. Simone walked him through it over 2 cups of bad coffee and the kind of matter-of-fact anger that comes from having explained something unjust so many times that the emotion has been compressed into pure information. The box, the will, the attorney, the judge, the week it took. The years Carol had spent afterward trying to understand how something that had been in her family since before the Civil War had simply ceased to exist in her possession without anyone having done anything technically wrong. The gentleman listened. He asked 3 questions. He thanked Simone for her time and left. He spent the following 2 weeks learning everything there was to know about Sutton Vance that wasn't in a news article. The news articles were flattering, which told him something. The things that weren't in the news articles told him considerably more. He learned Vance's Saturday morning routine through the kind of patient observation that is invisible precisely because it looks like nothing. A man reading a newspaper in a lobby. A man waiting for a car that takes slightly longer than expected to arrive. A man whose presence in a building's common areas is so unremarkable that the security cameras record it without anyone ever choosing to review the footage. He learned which insurance firm held Vance's collection policy and what the quarterly review cycle looked like. He learned the name of the paralegal who assembled the binder. He learned, through a chain of inference and confirmation that he did not rush, the specific rhythm of Vance's private Saturday mornings. The coffee, the binder, the window, the particular quality of attention Vance brought to documents he believed no one else would ever read. He learned about the collection room, the layout, the camera placement, the shift rotation, the biometric system, the specific make and model of the access infrastructure. He learned this not through any mechanism that would have alarmed Vance's security team, because the mechanism was the kind that security teams are specifically designed not to notice. He had been in the building 3 times, in a role that the building's facilities management system required, and that Vance's security apparatus had never once thought to examine. The fine art climate systems, the HVAC infrastructure that maintained the specific temperature and humidity parameters that a collection of that value required, needed quarterly inspection by a certified contractor. The contractor on record had a technician. The technician had been in that building unremarkably for 2 years. The gentleman was not that technician, but he had spoken to him at length over 3 separate conversations that the technician would later remember as routine professional courtesies from a man in the same industry. The technician had never understood those conversations as anything other than what they appeared to be. He had no reason to. The gentleman had not asked him for anything. He had simply listened and asked the kind of technical questions that established credibility and filed away everything that was useful and left nothing behind that indicated what the listening was for. By the end of the 3rd week, the gentleman understood the collection room the way you understand a room you've been in 100 times. He had not been in it once. He understood it anyway. He understood something else too. Something that mattered more than the layout, more than the shift rotation, more than any of the physical infrastructure Vance had built around his collection. He understood how Sutton Vance thought about risk. Vance was not a man who trusted systems. This was, on the surface, a paradox. His entire operation depended on legal and institutional systems to function, but Vance trusted those systems instrumentally, the way you trust a tool, because you understand its mechanics and you've learned to use it before it can be used against you. When the threat was external, when the threat came from outside the systems he knew, Vance's instinct was not to rely on those systems. His instinct was to go dark, to move whatever mattered to somewhere that no system could reach it, somewhere that existed only in his own knowledge, somewhere that was his and no one else's. The gentleman had identified that instinct 3 weeks before the card went into the binder. He had identified the location it would produce 2 weeks after that. The black bear had been in Vance's family for 3 generations. It stood in the corner of his private study. Not the office where he met with attorneys and associates, but the inner room, the one beyond the inner room, the one that existed on no floor plan that had been submitted to the building for permitting purposes. It was a large mount, a grizzly-sized black bear on a wooden base, posed in a posture of alertness that had probably been impressive when it was installed and had since become simply furniture. Vance's grandfather had commissioned the mount. Vance had moved it from the family house in Connecticut when his father died, not out of sentiment. Vance did not operate on sentiment, but out of a specific and private logic that the gentleman had spent considerable time reconstructing. The bear was the one thing in Vance's possession that was entirely, undeniably his. Not acquired, not transacted. Inherited through a chain of custody that predated every system Vance had ever learned to manipulate. In a world where Vance controlled his environment through documentation and process and the careful management of what was on record, the bear was the one object that existed outside all of that. It was simply his, in the oldest and most uncomplicated sense of that word. And the base, large, wooden, hollow, sealed with a panel that had been there since his grandfather's time and that Vance had opened, as far as anyone could document, exactly once, was the kind of hiding place that a man like Vance would arrive at when his calculus told him that no institutional system was safe enough. The gentleman had needed Vance to arrive at that calculus. The card was part of how he got there, but only part. 3 days before the card went into the binder, on a Wednesday, quiet, the kind of midweek afternoon when Vance's office operated at reduced capacity, a rumor entered Vance's network through a channel he trusted. Not a whisper, not an anonymous tip, a piece of information delivered by a source he had used for years, a source whose reliability he had never had reason to question, whose information had been accurate enough times that Vance had stopped asking how they got it. The information concerned his collection room. Specifically, it concerned the biometric access system, a suggestion delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who genuinely wasn't sure what to make of it, that the system had a vulnerability that certain people in certain circles were aware of. Not a certainty, a rumor. The kind of thing you couldn't verify without making calls that would reveal you were worried. Vance made 2 calls. Both of them were to people inside his own network. Neither confirmed the rumor. Neither denied it either, because neither of them knew anything about it, which meant either it was false or it was true, and they weren't in those circles. Vance sat with that ambiguity for 12 hours and arrived on his own at the conclusion that the collection room's biometric system was not sufficient protection for the item with no paper trail. He arrived at this conclusion because he was intelligent, because the rumor had been designed to be processed by an intelligent man, because the specific shape of the uncertainty it created pointed inevitably toward the one alternative that existed entirely outside institutional systems. He moved the box on a Friday morning, 2 days before the card appeared in the binder. He carried it himself in an interior coat pocket from the collection room to the private study, and he opened the panel in the base of the bear with a key he kept on his person, not on his keyring, on a separate ring with nothing else on it, and he placed the box inside and closed the panel and locked it. He stood back and looked at the bear for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at the collection room, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem he didn't expect to have to solve. The rumor about the biometric system had originated nowhere. There was no vulnerability. The source had delivered it in good faith because the source had received it in good faith from a man the source knew professionally and had no particular reason to doubt, who had mentioned it in passing during a conversation about something else entirely. The man who had mentioned it had done so in the specific artless way that makes a piece of information feel like it costs something to share. The slight hesitation, the lowered register, the sense of someone deciding in real time whether to say the thing or not. He had said it and then moved on, and the source had filed it away and eventually passed it to Vance because that was the nature of their arrangement. The man who had mentioned it was not easy to find after that. He worked in a field that required him to be in multiple buildings in the course of a week, and his schedule was legitimately unpredictable, and there was nothing about him that pointed anywhere in particular. He had mentioned a rumor. People mention rumors. There was no thread to pull. By the Saturday morning when Vance found the card in his binder, the box had been in the bear's base for 2 days. By the Saturday morning when Vance had Briggs on the phone and was reading the card aloud, the gentleman had already been in the private study, in a capacity so unremarkable that it required no explanation and left no memory. The building's facilities management system had logged the visit. Facilities management visits to a 42nd floor private residence are not reviewed by security unless there is a specific reason to review them. There was no reason. There was a work order, completed and closed, for a routine inspection of the climate control infrastructure in a room that contained sensitive materials. The box was gone before the card went on the wall. What Vance built over the following week, the 10 guards, the doubled camera coverage, the biometric audit, the conversations with Briggs about protocols and response times and contingencies, was not a defense. It was a monument to a problem that had already been solved by someone who had solved it before Vance knew there was a problem to solve, using the specific intelligence Vance had demonstrated in thinking his way to the bear. The monument was impressive. It protected a room that no longer contained what Vance was protecting it for. And the card on the wall, the one he'd laminated as a performance of confidence, hung there for the full week as a different kind of monument to the specific variety of arrogance that mistakes display for protection. Now, the Saturday it ended. Vance came to the private study at 9 in the morning, after the call with Briggs, after the third cup of coffee, after 20 minutes at the window deciding that the 10 guards were sufficient and the threat was being handled, and that whoever had sent the card had underestimated what it meant to threaten a man who had spent 31 years learning exactly how systems fail and building his own to compensate. He came to the study not because he was worried. He had decided specifically and deliberately not to be worried, but because he wanted to see the bear. He wanted to stand in the room with the thing he had protected and feel the specific satisfaction of a man whose preparations have been adequate. The panel was already closed. It was always closed. He knelt and examined the lock. His habit. The thing he did every time he came to check. And the lock was intact, undisturbed, exactly as he had left it on Friday morning when he'd placed the box inside. He stood. He looked at the bear. The bear looked back at him with the fixed, glassy attentiveness that taxidermied animals maintain across decades without any effort at all. And for a moment, Vance felt something he rarely permitted himself: relief. Then he looked at the wall above the collection room door, through the open doorway of the study, at the place where the laminated card had been since Tuesday. The wall was bare. He stood very still for a moment. Then he went to the collection room door and looked at the wall directly. The card was gone, not fallen. There were no marks on the wall where it might have slipped. No adhesive residue disturbed. Nothing that indicated accident. It had been removed, deliberately, cleanly, by someone who knew exactly where it was and had decided to take it. He went back to the study. He knelt at the bear. His hands were steady. Sutton Vance's hands were always steady. It was a point of pride. And he inserted the key and turned it and opened the panel. The box was gone. In its place, the laminated card. Returned to the hollow of the bear's base with the same care with which the box had been carried out, lying face up in the blue silk light of the space where the box had been, with one line added beneath the text in the same clean typeset as everything else that had been written to him over the past week. As promised, he read it twice. Then he sat back on his heels on the floor of his private study on the 42nd floor, with 10 guards 40 feet away protecting a room that had already been resolved, and he stayed there for a while. Not thinking, exactly. Processing. The way you process something that has been built specifically to be processed, that has been designed with full knowledge of how your mind works and what it needs in order to arrive at the understanding that is being offered to it. He understood several things at once, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives not as a sequence, but as a field. Everything at once, and you simply have to stand in it. He understood that the card had been taken from the wall before he arrived in the study, which meant someone had been in his private office in the inner room, in the room that existed on no floor plan. He understood that the box had been gone since before the card went on the wall, which meant the 10 guards had been protecting a room that was already resolved by the time he ordered their deployment. He understood that whoever had done this had known, before the card was ever sent, exactly where he would move the box, had known it well enough to have been there first. And he understood that this was not the understanding of someone who had guessed well. This was the understanding of someone who had read him with the same precision and care that he applied to other people, and had found the same leverage. He understood that he had been manipulated. Not surprised? Manipulated. The distinction mattered. Surprise is accidental. Manipulation is architectural. Someone had built a structure and walked him through it, and every decision he had made along the way, the laminated card, the 10 guards, the move to the bear, all of it had been a decision he had made himself, freely, intelligently, in full exercise of exactly the capabilities he was most confident in. His intelligence had been the instrument. His confidence had been the door. He did not call Briggs again that morning. He did not call anyone. He sat for a while longer, and then he stood, and he closed the panel, and he left the card where it was. He didn't take it out. He didn't destroy it. He left it in the hollow of the bear's base where it had been left for him, in the blue silk dark with its one added line. And he closed the panel and locked it and put the key back where he kept it, and walked out of the study and closed the door behind him. The 10 guards finished their rotation. They were not renewed. The story of what happened to the box after it left the bear's base is not a story that Sutton Vance ever told, because telling it would have required him to explain what was in the base, and explaining what was in the base would have required him to explain how it got there. And that explanation ended in rooms and conversations and document trails that Vance preferred to keep exactly where they were, unexamined, sealed in the past. Carol Beaumont received a package 3 weeks after that Saturday morning. She was 76 now, living in a house in West Philadelphia that was smaller than the house her brother had lived in, which was smaller than the house where the box had been for 200 years before any of this. The package arrived on a Tuesday, padded, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize, with no return address and a postmark from a city she'd never been to. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper of the kind used for archival storage, was the box. Federal period, carved wood, lock that no longer worked, interior lining of faded blue silk. There was no note, no explanation, no name. She called Simone at the legal aid clinic because Simone was the only person who had ever fully understood what losing it had meant. Simone listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not her usual approach. And when Carol finished, Simone was quiet for a moment and then said, "Put it somewhere safe." Carol said she would. She asked if Simone knew what had happened. Simone said she didn't know specifically. She said she had a sense of it. She said some things work out in ways that the paperwork doesn't cover. And that was probably all anyone needed to know. Carol kept the box on a table in her front room where she could see it from the chair she sat in when she read. She didn't lock it because the lock didn't work. She kept it open. The gentleman sat in a diner in a neighborhood Vance had never been to and would not have been able to find on a map. And he drank coffee that was worse than the coffee at the legal aid clinic. And he read the newspaper the way he always read newspapers, which is to say completely, starting from the back. There was nothing in the newspaper about Sutton Vance. There would not be. Vance was a man whose power depended on nothing being in newspapers about Sutton Vance, and that machinery did not switch off in the face of personal humiliation. It worked harder. It was the most reliable thing about him. The gentleman had not expected to feel very much when it was finished. He had been in this position before. Not this specific configuration of pieces, never exactly this, but the aftermath of something that had required long preparation and produced a clean result. And the feeling at the end of those things was rarely what anyone would call satisfaction. It was more like the cessation of a particular kind of attention. The attention you pay to a problem that has been solved. The silence where the work was. He thought about the box for a while, not the object itself. He had spent very little time with it, and it was not a thing he had any claim on. He thought about what it meant that a wooden box with a broken lock and a faded silk interior, could anchor a woman's understanding of what she had lost, and what it meant that Vance had kept it, not for any of the reasons Carol Beaumont had kept it, but for a reason that was essentially the opposite. Proof of a system rather than memory of a life. The same object, completely different gravity. He thought about the bear, the hiding place that Vance had arrived at through his own best thinking, through his own deepest logic about where things were safe, and the specific irony that his best thinking had been produced not by his own assessment of the situation, but by a rumor that had been designed to make him think in exactly that direction. The paranoid adversary goes dark. The intelligent adversary calculates. The man who has spent 31 years staying ahead of systems goes to the one place that exists outside systems. You just have to know in advance where outside the system lives for that specific person. Vance would not do anything about what had happened. This was not a guess. It was the most predictable outcome of the situation, and the gentleman had counted on it from the beginning. Reporting the loss required explaining what was lost. Explaining what was lost required explaining how it was acquired. That chain of explanation ran directly into the rooms and records that Vance had spent 3 decades ensuring no one looked at closely. The card in the bear's base was as safe as anything Vance had ever put there, which was to say, completely safe, because the cost of revealing it was higher than the cost of living with it. He finished his coffee. He left a tip that was larger than was strictly necessary because the service had been good and because he was in a particular mood. Not celebration, not satisfaction, but something quieter than either of those. The diner was full in the way diners are full on weekend mornings in neighborhoods that haven't been developed yet, which is to say, comfortably, with no performance attached to the fullness. He walked out into the morning and turned in a direction that had nothing to do with where Sutton Vance lived, and he did not think about Sutton Vance again that day. You made it to the end. That means something in a world where it's easy to leave. Here's what this story was about. Underneath the bear and the binder, and the 10 guards protecting a room that had already been resolved. It was about what happens when the techniques a person has used on others for 30 years get aimed back at them with the same precision they use to aim at everyone else. Vance built his career on reading people's distress and engineering their decisions. He was good at it. He was so good at it that he had stopped noticing it as a skill and started experiencing it as a natural state. The world as a system of levers, and himself as the person who knew where they were. The gentleman didn't outsmart Vance. He let Vance outsmart himself. With a small amount of carefully placed information and a complete understanding of where Vance's intelligence would take him when it was pointed in the right direction. The rumor about the biometric system, the card in the binder, the lamination, the wall, the performance of confidence that required the box to be somewhere else, somewhere entirely his own. Each decision made in full possession of his faculties, each decision exactly what the gentleman needed it to be. There is something clarifying about that, about the idea that the qualities you use to take from people can be the exact qualities that determine how you lose. Not despite your intelligence, because of it. A less careful man would have left the box in the collection room. A less strategic man would not have had a bear with a hollow base that existed in no one else's knowledge. It took Vance's specific brand of brilliant paranoia to find the one location the gentleman needed him to find. The question I'll leave you with is this. If someone told you this story without proof, just sitting across from you, just the telling of it, would you have believed it? And if not, what would it have taken? A document? A witness? The box itself? Think about what you require before you decide something is real. And think about what that says about the things you've already decided are impossible. Like this, if the bear will stay with you. Subscribe if you want to be here next time. The gentleman keeps his word. So does this channel.